There is a particular kind of silence that falls in certain family conversations. It arrives when a parent asks a simple question. How is the job search going? Have you thought about saving for a house? What are your plans? And the answer comes back careful, brief, a little tired. Not rude, not ungrateful, just quiet in a way that suggests the question itself has landed somewhere tender. Many people who are now in their 50s, 60s, or 70s have felt this silence. They have watched their children or grandchildren work hard, stay out of obvious trouble, and still seem to struggle in ways that are difficult to fully explain. The apartment that costs more than a mortgage used to. The degree that did not open the doors it was supposed to open. The career that started as a contract and never quite became permanent. The life that keeps being described as something they are still working toward, year after year, without the horizon seeming to get meaningfully closer. And somewhere in that watching, a quiet question forms. One that many older adults feel but rarely say aloud. Did we give them the right advice? Did the world change under them in ways we did not notice quickly enough? Or is there something else going on, something structural, something real, that none of us quite has the language to address? This is not a video about blame. It is not an argument about which generation had it harder, or who is responsible for what went wrong. Those conversations tend to generate more heat than understanding, and the people who suffer most from them are usually the ones who care most about each other. Parents and children who want to understand one another but keep reaching across a gap they cannot quite name. What this video is about is that gap itself. What created it, why it feels so confusing to people on both sides of it, and what becomes possible when we stop assigning fault and start trying to see clearly. Because there is something genuinely different about the world young people are inheriting. Not different in every way, not different in every country or every circumstance, but different in a set of specific, structural ways that have real and measurable consequences, and that deserve to be understood honestly, without exaggeration, and without the kind of generational resentment that makes honest conversation feel impossible before it has even begun. It is worth noting what this video is not. It is not a claim that young people today have it harder in every possible way than every previous generation. Human beings have faced poverty, war, famine, and dispossession on scales that dwarf anything being discussed here. History offers little comfort to the idea that any particular era has a monopoly on difficulty. The generations now in their 50s and 60s navigated their own recessions, their own uncertainties, their own moments when the future seemed to close. What this video is about is something more specific and more current. It is about a particular mismatch between the expectations that were passed down in good faith and the economic conditions those expectations were designed for, and the conditions that actually exist now. That mismatch is real, it is measurable, and it is causing genuine difficulty for a large number of people who are doing the right things and finding that the right things do not produce the results they were promised. Many people who came of age in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s followed something that felt like a roadmap. Not a perfect one, not an easy one for everyone, but one that had a certain legibility, a sense that if you paid attention and worked reasonably hard, you could read where you were supposed to go next. You worked hard in school, you got a job, or trained for a trade, or found your way into a career. Over time, if you were reasonably careful, you could afford a place to live. You might get married, have children, build something that felt like a life. The path had obstacles, and not everyone traveled it without hardship. But the path itself existed. People could see it, people could describe it to their children. People could offer advice based on it that was actually useful, not because they were especially wise, but because the world they were describing still resembled the world their children were living in. What has happened in the decades since is that the path has not disappeared entirely. But it has changed in ways that are easy to miss if you traveled it some time ago and have not looked closely at it recently. The distances are longer than they used to be. Some bridges have washed out quietly. The cost of the journey has risen significantly, while the wages for making it have not kept pace. And the map that older generations used, the advice they received, the assumptions they made, the strategies that worked for them, is in some important cases now pointing toward roads that no longer lead where they used to. That is what we are going to explore today. Slowly, honestly, without exaggeration on one side, and without dismissal on the other. With the kind of care this subject genuinely deserves. To understand why the path is different, it helps to go back and look carefully at what it actually looked like when it was working. In the decades after the Second World War, the Western economies, and particularly the American economy, went through a period of expansion that was historically unusual. Wages rose steadily across the income distribution, even for people without advanced degrees. A single income could support a family in many parts of the country. Housing was not cheap, but it was priced in a relationship with wages that made it, for a large portion of working people, achievable. Not effortless, not guaranteed, but within reach if you worked steadily and did not encounter extraordinary misfortune. A person who graduated from high school in 1970 could, if they worked consistently and made reasonably careful decisions, expect to own a home by their early to mid-30s. They could expect that a stable job, not glamorous, not exceptional, but steady and genuine, would provide something close to security over time. A pension, perhaps, healthcare, the sense that if you showed up and did your work, there would be something to show for it as the years accumulated. The generation that came after, people born in the 1980s and 90s, grew up hearing about that world. Many of them were raised by people who lived it, or who were raised by people who did. The advice they received was shaped entirely by it. Study hard, work diligently, save carefully, be responsible. These were not bad pieces of advice. They remain good principles, but they were calibrated for a specific set of economic conditions. And those conditions have shifted in ways that are larger than most everyday conversations acknowledge. Consider housing first, because it is the most visible piece of the puzzle. In many major cities and even many mid-sized towns across the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, and Australia, the ratio between home prices and median household incomes changed dramatically over the course of 4 decades. In the early 1980s, a typical home in many American cities cost somewhere between 2 and 3 times the median annual household income. Today, in many of those same cities, that ratio has climbed to 6, 8, 10 times the median income, or higher in the most expensive markets. In cities like Los Angeles, Sydney, London, and Toronto, the numbers are even more extreme. This is not a minor adjustment to the math of homeownership. It is a fundamental change in what is accessible to a person of ordinary wages and ordinary savings habits. The same effort, applied the same way, across the same number of years, simply does not reach as far. A young couple who saves diligently for 5 years may accumulate a deposit that would have bought a comfortable family home for their parents' generation and today represents a modest entry into a small apartment in a less desirable neighborhood. The comparison is not imaginary. The arithmetic is real. Then there is the cost of education. A college degree in the United States, for example, cost a fraction in 1980 of what it costs today, even after adjusting for general inflation. A generation was told, consistently and sincerely, that education was the reliable path to better income and greater security. That education was an investment that would pay itself back. Many people entered the education system on that basis, committed to the promise, and came out the other end carrying debts that would have seemed incomprehensible to their parents, and in some cases found that the income premium the degree was supposed to deliver had narrowed, or was only available in specific sectors with their own particular barriers to entry. The result was a generation that did what it was supposed to do and found that doing it cost more and delivered less certainty than they had been led to expect. And then there is the nature of work itself. Stable, long-term employment with benefits, the kind of position that allowed previous generations to plan years in advance, to take out a mortgage with confidence about what their income would look like, to build incrementally toward a pension, has become less common across many industries. The growth of contract work, gig employment, and short-term arrangements means that many young adults are doing real work, contributing genuine value, and still unable to access the kind of predictability that would allow them to plan a life. They are working. They are often working very hard. But they are working without the economic scaffolding that makes effort add up to something stable over time. Healthcare is another piece that deserves attention. In countries where healthcare is tied to employment, the fragmentation of stable work means that more young adults are navigating medical costs without the insurance protections their parents' generation often had as a matter of course. In countries with national health systems, those systems are operating under different kinds of pressure: longer waiting times, larger populations, growing complexity. Either way, the relationship between a young adult's health and their financial situation has become more precarious than it was for the generation before them. And underneath all of these specific changes is a broader shift in the texture of economic life. The post-war economy was not perfect, and it was not equally accessible to everyone. But for a significant portion of the population, it offered something that has become harder to name because it has become less common: predictability. The ability to look 5 years ahead and have some reasonable sense of where you would be. The ability to make commitments, financial commitments, relational commitments, plans, with some confidence that the ground you were standing on would still be there when the time came. Predictability is the quiet infrastructure of adult life. It is what allows people to form families, take on mortgages, commit to communities, plan for retirement. When it erodes, when income is unstable, when housing costs are volatile, when the rules of employment change faster than people can adapt, the effects are not just financial. They are deeply personal. They touch the sense of control over one's own life that is one of the basic conditions of adult dignity. None of these changes happened all at once. They accumulated over decades, mostly outside the frame of everyday conversation. A house was still called a house. A job was still called a job. A degree was still called a degree. But the thing each of those words referred to had quietly changed its weight and its cost and its relationship to everything around it. And the gap between the old meaning and the new reality became a persistent source of confusion, a frustration that neither generation had quite developed the language to address directly. What does all of this actually look like in a person's life? Not in a report, not in a set of statistics, but in the daily experience of being a young adult trying to navigate the current moment with sincerity and effort? It looks like staying in your parents' home longer than you planned. Not because you lack ambition or avoiding responsibility, but because the first apartment costs more than the available income allows without serious strain. It looks like turning down an opportunity to move to a city where there might be better work, because the rent in that city would consume most of what the work would pay, and the calculation simply does not close no matter how you run it. It looks like taking the job that pays slightly more, even if it is not the one you would have chosen, because the pressure of student loans leaves you with fewer choices than you thought you would have. It looks like watching the years pass, not in idleness, but in motion, in effort, in showing up and doing what is required, and finding that the distance between where you were and where you expected to be is stubbornly unchanged or even growing. There is a particular kind of conversation that happens between young couples in this situation. It is the conversation about whether to have children, not a conversation about whether they want them, because often they do, but a practical conversation, held in the quiet of an apartment that is too small or a financial situation that is too uncertain, about whether the timing will ever be right. And what makes these conversations so heavy is the sense that the timing is not a matter of patience, that it is not simply a case of waiting a little longer, but that the conditions required may be genuinely difficult to reach given the resources available. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from effort that does not translate into visible progress. Not the tiredness of physical labor, which at least leaves something concrete behind it, but the quieter tiredness of working consistently, doing what you were told would work, and watching the gap between where you were and where you expected to be stay exactly the same, or widen. It has a specific quality, that tiredness. It is not laziness. It is the emotional cost of sustained effort without the confirmation that the effort is pointing anywhere. Many young adults carry this quietly. They do not complain constantly. They do not broadcast their frustration, partly because complaining feels ungrateful when others clearly have it worse. Partly because they are not sure their frustration is legitimate, because they have been surrounded, since childhood, by a cultural message that says success is primarily a matter of attitude and discipline. And that message leaves a specific kind of residue. If I am struggling, perhaps I am not trying hard enough. Perhaps there is something wrong with my approach, my choices, my character. This is one of the most quietly damaging aspects of a structural problem being misread as a personal one. The person who cannot afford a house in their city does not only lose a home. They also, in a culture that still treats homeownership as a milestone of responsible adult life, carry the unspoken suggestion that they have not yet properly arrived at adulthood. The person who cannot find stable work does not only face financial insecurity. They also navigate the social discomfort of not having a clean answer to the question that still organizes much of social identity. What do you do, and where are you going? The delay of what previous generations considered normal life milestones, the stable job, the home, the family, is not simply a financial inconvenience. It is a reorganization of the emotional calendar of adult life. The years when people expected, based on everything they had been told, to be building a foundation are often spent trying to find the building site. And the longer that suspension continues, the harder it becomes to maintain the conviction that it will eventually resolve. There is something else worth noticing, which is how this situation affects the relationship people have with their own ambition. Ambition, the desire to build something, to go somewhere, to become something, depends on a felt sense that it is worth the effort. That the investment of energy and attention and years will eventually produce something in return. When that felt sense erodes, ambition does not simply disappear, but it changes shape. It becomes more cautious, more private, less willing to announce itself in case the announcement becomes something to be embarrassed by later. Young people in this situation often develop what you might call a quiet pragmatism. They stop planning for the life they want and start managing the life they have. They become skilled at surviving rather than building. And while survival is not nothing, it is in fact an enormous achievement in difficult circumstances, it is not the same as flourishing. And a generation that is primarily focused on surviving is not bringing its full capacity to the world. That is a loss that belongs to everyone, not just to the people experiencing it directly. This has real effects on families, on the relationship between parents and adult children, on the conversations that happen, or that quietly do not happen, at holiday dinners and Sunday phone calls. On the advice that is offered with genuine love but sometimes lands like a small wound, because it assumes a map that no longer matches the terrain the younger person is trying to navigate. There is an idea, rarely stated aloud but widely felt, that holds most modern societies together. It is not written in any law. It does not appear in any official document. But it operates as a kind of background expectation, a quiet assumption that shapes how people plan their lives, raise their children, make sense of their place in the larger world. The idea is roughly this: if you do what is expected of you, if you work hard, behave responsibly, contribute genuinely, and avoid serious failures of character, the world will meet you with something approaching fairness. Not perfection, not comfort guaranteed, not freedom from loss or hardship, but a basic correspondence between effort and outcome, a sense that what you put in and what you can reasonably expect to receive are not wildly mismatched. Work diligently, and work will reward you. Be responsible over time, and responsibility will offer some measure of protection. Follow the understood rules, and the rules will, broadly speaking, return the favor. This is what people sometimes call the social contract. It is partly an economic arrangement and partly a moral one. It says that the society you belong to and the economy you participate in are not simply forces operating against you, but structures that will, broadly speaking, work in your interest if you work within them in good faith. For much of the 20th century, and particularly in the post-war decades, something like this contract held for a large portion of the Western population. It did not hold perfectly. There were enormous inequalities, and people who were excluded from its benefits by race, gender, class, or circumstance in ways that deserved their own serious reckoning. But for a large enough share of working people, the basic correspondence between effort and stability was real enough to make a certain kind of hope feel rational. Not naive, not romantic, just realistic. The kind of hope that could actually be acted upon, that could organize a life and point it in a meaningful direction. What happens when that correspondence begins to break down? Not dramatically, not in a single crisis that everyone can point to, but gradually, when the relationship between effort and outcome becomes less reliable, when the path that worked for the previous generation becomes less accessible, when the promises passed down from parents to children start to feel more like myths than like practical guidance. What happens first is confusion. People continue doing what they were told to do, expecting the results they were told to expect, and finding a growing gap between the two. They search for explanations. They examine their attitude, their discipline, their choices. They wonder what they are doing wrong. And when they cannot locate the failure in themselves, because there is no failure to locate, only a changed structural reality, they begin to suspect that the problem is somewhere in the system. But they feel uncertain how to name it clearly, or whether they are permitted to say it without sounding like they are making excuses. What follows, often, is a form of private grief. Not dramatic, not announced, but real. Grief for the life that was supposed to unfold but has not. For the timeline that was absorbed in childhood, the stages of adulthood that seemed like natural progressions, and now sits in tension with the timeline that is actually playing out. For the things that were supposed to be available by a certain age, and that keep being postponed not through lack of effort but through lack of access. And eventually, for some, there is a quiet revision of hope itself. Not a conscious decision, more like a slow adjustment. The scope of what feels possible contracts. The ambitions that were once specific, the home, the stable career, the family, the small but genuine independence, become more conditional, more hedged, more protected against repeated disappointment. Not cynicism exactly, more like emotional realism. The kind that forms when optimism keeps running into a wall that does not move. This matters not just for the young people experiencing it, but for everyone, because a society in which a significant portion of the working-age population has quietly stopped believing in the correspondence between effort and outcome is a different kind of society. It has different politics, different energy, different relationships between the generations. The willingness to invest in the future, to form families, to build institutions, to participate fully in communal life, depends, more than we often acknowledge, on the felt sense that the future is genuinely accessible to ordinary effort. There is also something worth saying about identity. For many people, the milestones of early adulthood, the first home, the stable career, the family, are not simply practical achievements. They are markers of a particular kind of identity. They are how a person recognizes themselves as a fully formed adult. How they position themselves in relation to the generation that came before. How they know they have arrived at the place they were heading toward. When those markers are delayed or simply unreachable, the effect is not just financial. It is existential in a quiet way. People find themselves at 35 or 40 in a position their parents were in at 27, and the mismatch carries a particular kind of discomfort that is hard to explain to someone who traveled the older timeline smoothly. It is not that they are unhappy people. It is not that they lack values or seriousness. It is that the moment of full arrival, the moment of saying to themselves and to the world, "I have built this, I am here," keeps being deferred. And deferred. And deferred again. The psychological cost of that deferral is real. Researchers who study adult development have noted for decades that the tasks of midlife, the consolidation of identity, the passage of wisdom to the next generation, the sense of having contributed something lasting, depend in part on having a stable foundation from which to operate. When the foundation remains uncertain well into the years when it was supposed to be secure, The whole timeline of adult development is affected. Not broken, but altered. And that alteration deserves to be recognized honestly rather than dismissed as weakness or ingratitude. Here is where older generations carry a responsibility that is not primarily financial and not primarily practical. It is the responsibility of honest witness, of being willing to say, clearly and without defensiveness, the world I came of age in and the world I am looking at now are not the same world. I see that, and I understand that the gap between them is not a measure of your effort, your discipline, or your character. It is a measure of how much the conditions changed between one generation and the next. That acknowledgement matters enormously, not because it fixes housing prices, not because it pays down anyone's debt, but because it changes the nature of the conversation between parents and children, between the generation that made it through and the generation currently trying to find its way. It moves the conversation from a place of unspoken judgment, why can't you manage what we managed, why do you seem so stuck, to a place of shared recognition. The world changed. We are trying to understand it together. The advice we pass between generations is one of the most ordinary forms of love. When a parent explains to a child how to navigate the world, they are offering the distillation of their own experience, the condensed lessons of decades lived. It is a gift, genuinely meant. But it is a gift calibrated to the world the giver navigated. And when that world has changed significantly, the gift sometimes needs to be adjusted. Not discarded, adjusted. You can still believe in patience, and also acknowledge that some things that patience used to solve now require different solutions. You can still believe in discipline, and also acknowledge that disciplined savings in a world of expensive housing and stagnant wages does not deliver what it once delivered. These are not contradictions. They are simply honest updates to a map that was made for a terrain that has shifted. None of what has been said here is meant to leave anyone feeling helpless. The aim is not to catalog difficulty and rest there. Clarity is where honest help actually begins, and seeing a problem accurately is not the same thing as being defeated by it. When an older adult truly understands that the obstacles facing their children or grandchildren are not primarily the result of poor choices or inadequate effort, something changes in the quality of attention they bring to those relationships. The quiet frustration, the barely spoken "why don't they just do what we did," gives way to something more useful. Genuine curiosity, the kind that does not assume it already knows the answer. An actual interest in what the world looks like from the younger person's position, rather than from the position occupied 40 years ago. And when a young person feels that an older person genuinely sees the structural reality of their situation, not simply offering advice drawn from different circumstances, not quietly disappointed in outcomes that were never really within reach, something shifts for them as well. The shame that quietly accumulates around struggling without obvious cause begins to loosen. Not completely, not all at once, but enough to make a different kind of conversation possible, one in which the younger person does not feel the need to pretend everything is fine, and the older person does not feel the need to pretend they understand a world they have not had to navigate. These conversations, genuine, grounded, free of the need to perform competence on one side or gratitude on the other, are among the most valuable things that can happen within families and between generations. They are harder to have than the surface version. They require a particular willingness from both sides. From older adults, the willingness to hold their own experience more lightly. To say, honestly, the world I navigated and the world you are navigating may have more differences than I initially realized. I don't fully understand what it is like where you are standing right now, but I would like to. And to mean that as an invitation, not as a prelude to more advice, but as a genuine opening to being informed. From younger adults, the willingness to explain without resentment, to assume that the confusion on the other side is genuine rather than willful, that the people who came before them did not intend to pass on a misleading map, but simply drew from the territory they knew. To give the generation that preceded them the chance to understand, rather than writing them off as incapable of it. This is easier to describe than to practice. Family relationships are not abstract. They carry the weight of many years, of expectations formed when children were small and the future seemed more legible. They carry moments of disappointment on both sides, misunderstandings that accumulated over time, unspoken comparisons and unmet hopes. Conversations about money and struggle are among the most emotionally loaded conversations that families have, because money is rarely only about money. It carries dignity, identity, the sense of being seen and taken seriously. But the conversations are possible. And they become more possible when they are grounded in honest, clear information, not in the mythology of what should have been, not in the bitterness of what was not delivered, but in the plain acknowledgement that specific things changed in the world between one generation and the next, and that those changes have consequences that are real and worth talking about without shame on either side. Progress is still possible. It takes different forms now. It requires different strategies and is measured against different benchmarks than it was in 1975 or 1985. But it is not absent. Young people are finding ways, navigating the current conditions with creativity and resilience, building lives that look different from their parents' lives and are no less genuine for that difference. The forms of a life change with the world that contains it. What does not change, or does not need to, is the substance underneath. The patience, the commitment to honesty, the willingness to care for others, the habits of attention and responsibility that make a person someone others can rely on. The older generation can offer those things, not as the whole of what it means to succeed in a changed world, but as the part of the inheritance that ages well regardless of economic conditions. The conviction that how you treat people matters, that the way you show up over time leaves a trace. That the capacity to sit with difficulty without being destroyed by it is one of the more important things a person can develop. Perhaps what this moment genuinely asks of us, of all of us, regardless of where we are standing in the long procession of generations, is a particular quality of honesty with each other. Not the honesty of accusation, not the honesty that assigns fault and moves on, but the honesty of two groups of people who care about each other, looking at the same changed world from very different vantage points, and choosing to compare notes with patience rather than argue about who has the truer view. That is not a small thing. It requires the humility to acknowledge that our own experience may not be the universal template. It requires the patience to genuinely listen to someone whose struggle looks unlike any struggle we have personally known. It requires the maturity to say, I was given something by my time and my circumstances that you were not given by yours, and I see that now, and I am sorry it took me this long to say so clearly. And it requires, in return, the generosity to receive that acknowledgement without turning it into a grievance, to accept the love that is trying to find its way across a gap it does not fully understand, even when it arrives in forms that are still slightly clumsy and not quite right. The world has changed. In the specific, material, structural ways that determine whether ordinary effort can build an ordinary life, it has changed enough to matter, enough to make the old map unreliable in important places. Understanding that is not the end of the conversation. It is where a better conversation can finally begin. What that better conversation looks like will be different in every family, every community, every relationship between an older person and a younger one. There is no single script for it, no formula that dissolves the complexity. But it tends to start with the same quality. The willingness to set aside what you think you already know and ask, genuinely, what it is like to be where the other person is standing. That willingness is not a small thing. It asks us to hold our own experience loosely, to treat it as one case in a larger story rather than as the measure by which all other cases are judged. For people who built their lives through genuine effort and genuine sacrifice, this is not always easy. It can feel like a diminishment of what they worked for to acknowledge that the conditions have changed. But it is not that. Acknowledging that circumstances changed is not the same as saying the effort didn't matter. The effort mattered enormously. The character it built is real. The sacrifices were real. The lives constructed on that foundation were real. What has changed is the environment in which the next generation is trying to do the same. And recognizing that clearly, without defensiveness, without the need to prove that one's own path was harder or easier or better or worse, is one of the more generous things one generation can offer another. There is something quietly powerful about an older person saying to a younger one, "I see what you're up against. I don't fully understand all of it, but I see it, and I believe you when you say it's hard. Not because you're weak, because the ground has shifted in ways that matter, and navigating shifting ground takes a kind of strength that deserves to be recognized, not minimized." That recognition is not everything, but it is not nothing. It is the beginning of the honesty that makes genuine help possible, not the help of old advice applied to new problems, but the deeper help of simply being present to someone's actual experience without the need to explain it away.